so forgive my voice because this is CES and I've been doing things since Monday. Rather than do the show of hands about how many people have heard of Bitcoin or have Bitcoin, I'm going to ask a simple question. Who in the audience knows what Sunday was this Sunday? Anyone? It was the 7th anniversary of Bitcoin. Bitcoin was conceived in a white paper in late 2008, and Satoshi Nakamoto, clearly a pseudonym, put out a white paper saying, I think I found the answer for what we've all been looking for in terms of having a digital asset, a digital currency, something that can sort of be almost a bit torrent for money and some other things as well. And nobody really paid too much attention to him, so he said, I guess I'm going to do this myself. And January 3rd of 2009, not that long ago, he created what's called the Genesis block, which is where he started mining, and we can get a little bit into that. With a half hour, we can't go into too many details. Essentially, it's distributed digital payment processing. And literally a year and a half later, there were still only 100 to 150 people involved. Today, Coinbase, I believe, has 3 million users. So we are actually, even though we're at the very beginning of sort of the Bitcoin blockchain digital asset curve, think of where we were in maybe '94 for the web. But I believe all three of us are unified in our belief that Bitcoin, the blockchain, and digital currency is as important and game-changing as the web was and social networks. And they all were misunderstood in their times. I remember back when MySpace had to go state by state and be asked why we should be legal in the state of Connecticut until you can prove that every single person on MySpace is who they say they are. You don't really hear that with Facebook. So without further ado, I'm going to let Brock and Charlie tell a little bit about their backgrounds. I'll sort of preface it with, I've known Brock for 15 years. He was actually one of the earliest leaders. He had his first funded startup when he was 18. Raised $85 million. And then he started really the largest company in the virtual gaming sector, which is really the first kind of virtual currency before you even had cryptocurrency. Was really early in Bitcoin, obviously, as was Charlie. And Brock really brought me into Bitcoin. He said, hey, I'm changing all my focus into Bitcoin. And this was about 3 years ago, and I went to the first Bitcoin conference and fell down the rabbit hole and started BitAngels and a lot of other things since. And
Sorry, or you're welcome.
Thank you. So, and Brock now heads up the largest venture group in terms of number of companies and investments, blockchain capital in terms of other things, and I'll let you finish and then we'll move on to Charlie.
Yeah, I'll try and keep it brief. Been an entrepreneur, started a dozen or so companies over the years in the digital currency space around games. If you've heard of things like Second Life or World of Warcraft, I recognized in the late 90s that these digital assets that existed in these persistent worlds or spaces, albeit intangible, had value. But there were no game companies in the world selling digital currency at that time. So I decided to make a market for these intangible assets. I built up a supply chain of about 400,000 people, primarily in China in the early 2000s, that would play video games professionally to mine digital currency out of games like World of Warcraft, and then I would sell that to people all over the world. I still do a little over $1 billion a year in that business today, but that's what led me to Bitcoin. When I first saw Bitcoin, because I've kind of been around since the beginning, I said, okay, this is interesting. This or something like it is the future. I just don't know if the future is now or 25 years from now. And Michael was one of the first calls I made when I decided to drop everything I was doing to focus on this space exclusively, which started with me incubating a few companies. Realized, like with the internet, there's a huge number of opportunities here. Which one is going to be the biggest? I didn't have that insight. So rather than building one company as CEO, as I historically have done as an entrepreneur, I said, okay, let me start a bunch of them. And then I realized there's more opportunity here than I have the ability to participate in as a incubator or an accelerator. And so I became a venture capitalist. I'm on my second fund today, again, very descriptive, Blockchain Capital, which is the underlying technology that makes Bitcoin possible. I've got a little over 40 investments in the space, Coinbase being one of them. And I'm also the chairman of the Bitcoin Foundation, which is the sort of leading industry association with thousands of members, both industry as well as individuals. And in terms of macro sort of perspective, I believe there's been 3 sort of fundamental technologies created in, call it our lifetimes. The semiconductor or the computer, TCP/IP, or the protocol that makes the internet possible, and the blockchain, which is the underlying technology here. When I say fundamentally disruptive, there is no life and there is no business on this planet that will not be impacted by it. And if you take away anything from today's discussion, it's worth taking an hour or two to try and understand why this is. Over the course of last year, most of the major banks, most of the major financial institutions have all said, we like this, we're on board. Not really Bitcoin per se, and the way that I often describe it for people that are trying to, because sometimes you're going to have a negative visceral reaction, largely due to Bitcoin having a fair amount of, call it bad press over its early years, like most emerging technologies. But think of Bitcoin kind of as a proof of concept. The technology works, or think of it as kind of like the blockchain is the operating system and Bitcoin is the first application that's been built. And so now you're seeing major financial institutions saying, hey, this is interesting. And the fundamental technology is we solved the industry, or Satoshi solved what's called the Byzantine generals problem, which is the only way that you could conduct trade with someone on a peer-to-peer basis historically is if I hand Michael a bill or a nugget of gold. Any other type of transaction has always required a trusted counterparty, or an intermediary to facilitate those transactions. And what Bitcoin has solved is the ability for peer-to-peer trade to occur over any distance using the web.
Thank you, Brock. And then Charlie is really a pioneer in both Bitcoin and in the blockchain. When I first went to this first conference, that was the first Bitcoin Foundation conference, it's also the first time people in the Bitcoin world really got to meet each other. It was the first conference that had more than maybe 60 or 70 people in it. And this was 1,000 people, which was like this huge gathering in 2013, which seems like we're talking about the 1890s these days. So people getting in now, you're still early, but 2013, and of course we met people like Brock and Charlie were there, who were in 2009, 10, 11. What Charlie did, besides what he's doing now with Coinbase, and Coinbase actually, at that first conference, everybody had little 10 by 10 tables, and Brian, your CEO, was standing out front with giving out T-shirts with a 10 by 10, and it reminded me of the first internet world when you had Lycos and Yahoo, and in the same type of thing, and a few years later they're like multi-billion-dollar companies. So we still have a couple years to sort of see that trajectory. Internet world grew to, I think, 70 or 80,000 people from the first one that was about 1,000 or 2. I think that there's more challenges when you're disrupting something that is hot button for people as money, as opposed to really in the beginning, the web was about disrupting communications and publishing, and really was seen as more intelligent printing press. But really what Charlie did with Litecoin was to really be the first person to go and create a new blockchain from the open source software. And you can tell us a little bit about your inspiration for that, which now there have been tons of blockchains, and a little bit of the difference between Bitcoin and the blockchain for the sort of novice audience.
Sure. So let me correct you. So I wasn't the first person to actually create an alternative coin. Other people have done it before, but my coin became the most successful out of all of them. So the idea behind creating Litecoin was, at the time I realized that people wanted choices. People wanted to have another coin to play with, and Bitcoin being like super secure and having a huge market cap, the developers are less willing to experiment on it because if they change something, cause a problem, it could cause people to lose a lot of money. So whereas I can experiment with Litecoin a little bit more. So that kind of fostered a huge altcoin community where people were experimenting with different kinds of coins. And it kind of just grew from there. And I didn't expect it to become what it is today. Litecoin's market cap today is, I believe, a little bit over $150 million. When I first found out about Bitcoin a little bit more than 4 years ago, Bitcoin's market cap was only 200 million. So Litecoin is almost as big as when I first found out about Bitcoin, size of Bitcoin. So that's totally didn't expect that. I was just doing it for fun. And
now, of course, people are experimenting with Litecoin. It's one of the coins that people find, sort of like the most friendly to play around with and like make other new coins. In fact, Halsey Miner talked this morning about Voxelis. I've worked with him on sort of strategizing the coin, the Voxel, and it was, the obvious choice to play around with Litecoin and
yeah, almost
tweak there.
all the other altcoins were forked from the Litecoin code base. Yeah.
So how long did it take you to make Litecoin?
Technically, it wasn't that hard because I tried to keep it the same with Bitcoin and only change a few parameters. So I think technically, coding-wise, only like a few hours. Yeah, but I spent a lot of time.
So about $50 million of market cap per hour of coding.
Yeah.
Great. So I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of where we are right now. We're 7 years in. It was really slow to get started, and then you went through this massive period in 2013 where it started out at $13 and not many users, and there's still mixed sort of reviews about what really caused the run up to 1100, whether it was kind of games playing with Mt. Gox because they had so much of the trading market versus Cyprus and some reactions around that. Many people think if there's a crisis with the euro, again, that could really be an exponential grower of the value of Bitcoin, the currency. We're right now.
The broader financial markets have had a bit of a rough start this year.
They have.
Bitcoin's had a pretty good start to the year. I think we're at like a 75-week high.
Yes. So we're 7 years in. We've gone from the first time that anybody actually even gave a value for Bitcoin was about a year and a half in, and it was 1/10 of a cent. And it went in 3 years from 1,000 Bitcoins for $1 to $1,000 per Bitcoin. So that's a million X. Very few investments in history have had that kind of return. So 7 years in, a lot of the early volatility, it's gotten less volatile every year. There was an article that came out recently. It's decreases volatility double digits every year as it's gotten bigger. As most things that are larger have less volatility. And then you've also got the fact that we're only 7 years in, and the coin is going to be still mined for another 100+ years. But we just passed 15 million out of the 21 million. And in the decelerating way that mining works, the last 100 years is only about 100,000 of the coins. So let's go ahead 7 years from now. Where do you see us being in 2023?
Well, we started the year on a good note. Again, at a 75-week high. I think there's, call it 10 or so million, sort of people in the world that have, some amount of Bitcoin, but you're really looking at, call it 1 million people today. So if you feel like you're a little too late to the game, it's incredibly early. By the time you leave this room, you're going to be, some of the world's leading experts when it comes to understanding this technology. It's very, very, very early. Again, it's back to like 1994 internet. But the world's changed a lot since 1994. The speed at which businesses can go from 0 to 1 billion users, whether it be Facebook, WhatsApp. I think that this could happen potentially very quickly. I think it will take time because most people here in America don't understand why Bitcoin is interesting. Actually, a lot of times people come to me and say, Brock, well, I don't understand. Why do I need it? And I go, the reality is you don't. You most likely live in a country where my guess is you all have bank accounts. You probably have a convenient piece of plastic in your pocket that allows you to pay for things. We've got rule of law that's here to protect us in most instances if something bad happens to us. We've got general faith in the system, and of the 200 currencies in the world, we have one that everyone wants more of. It's not really something that you're going to go, it's not going to change your life in the short term, other than as a speculative investment that may appreciate. But if you are one of the 70 million Americans that are on or underbanked, that may have to send money back to the Philippines or south of the border, if you live in a place like Southeast Asia or Africa, these are the people whose lives are going to be materially impacted by a technology like this. And so that's where I think most of that sort of growth is going to come from. And if you want to understand sort of the value proposition, you need to generally think beyond our own sort of lives where we take most of these things for granted.
Well, there's first world and third world, and there's also individual and there's corporate. So on the business side, the real early adoption has been merchants, and you're a founder of GoCoin, and you know, and obviously Coinbase and is the largest one in this space, and BitPay are the big three that are going and saying, hey, you can go in as a merchant, accept Bitcoin, take no risk if you don't believe in Bitcoin at all, and just simply pay 0 to 1% instead of 2.7%. And it's still been a little bit rough going just explaining that to people, but there are other things from the consumer standpoint. We're both investors in Purse.io, where you can go in and get things off of Amazon that don't even have 2 or 3% profit margins at 20% off because you're arbitraging Bitcoin.
I think the main value proposition for anyone in the room is you get 20% off on all your purchases at Amazon if you pay with Bitcoin. That's enough of a motivation to buy some Bitcoin. 20% off on all your electronics, everything you buy from Amazon is worth going out and get some Bitcoin. And if you want to actually accumulate Bitcoin holdings, anyone that's an Amazon Prime customer, you can start getting a lot of Bitcoin for free. Every time you make a purchase on Amazon, do it with Bitcoin, and that 20% savings, you just pay 120%. And you'll end up spending not $1 more than you currently spent, and 20% of all your spending on Amazon over time will accumulate into a Bitcoin savings account.
And the reason why Bitcoin might take so long to kind of become mainstream is it's hard to disrupt finance, right? There's the legacy, like the banking system, is just also ingrained. It's really hard to disrupt. And Bitcoin, even today, is fairly hard to use for the average person.
Let's talk about cross-border payments, though, because I honestly think that that's an opportunity that while individuals are trying to figure out how the taxi cab driver uses Abra or uses one of these other things, and again, raw Bitcoin has still come a long ways. When we first got, when we first had that conversation, I mean, there was only one exchange, Mt. Gox. It wasn't a very good exchange. And, most people had the Bitcoin QT wallet. You didn't have, I've got 2 mobile wallets for Bitcoin on here, Airbits and Bread Wallet, and those didn't exist a year ago. And they're very easy to go. I can send anybody in the room here, a Bitcoin or 1/10 of a Bitcoin or 100th of Bitcoin just by pressing a button.
Yeah, most of the sort of Bitcoin adoption, I think, over the course of the next few years is going to come from people using it but not knowing they're using it. In the same way, and I like this analogy, where when we used to make phone calls 20 years ago, it was done over twisted copper wires. And one day it shifted over to voice over IP, but how many of you recognized when that happened, unless you were in the telecommunications business? You didn't. And in the same way that people talked about how voice over IP was going to disrupt the telecommunication industry and the telcos were going to go away, the reality is the telcos co-opted the technology, which is the same thing that financial institutions are doing with the blockchain today. They said, hey, this is a better, faster, cheaper way to do things. Let's go take that into our middle and back office so that we can do what we do currently more efficiently. So I think most of it's going to be done in a way where you don't realize you're using it.
Yeah, what I would see happening is like Western Union right now doing remittance, right? You're sending money to the Philippines using Western Union. So Western Union could take advantage of the Bitcoin technology, blockchain technology, and have the back end be Bitcoin, and you wouldn't even know it, and it will be cheaper for them, right? They'll save costs. And if they don't pass on the savings to the customers, you know what? Someone else will come and actually do that.
So this is a good segue to the blockchain. So essentially the blockchain, as it's used today, when people say blockchain investments, they're usually talking about a fork or a copy of the open source of Bitcoin or Litecoin or some other coin that basically does not have a trading value. So it's permissioned versus non-permissioned, and you're able to go and use it just for its technology aspects as opposed to having to worry about being worth something one day, worth something another day. There are also some things where you do have Bitcoin in the middle, but you basically don't take any risk because the provider is saying, I'll do a buy and a sell, and the 1/10 of a point they're going to spend on an exchange is still way less than what I would be paying to go through the SWIFT system, and it's immediate. I mean, Halsey this morning with Uphold, they do that. There's a number of other places that do that. I mean, essentially you do that with GoCoin, and I think that you're still having this massive opportunity. Forget about a remittance. How many trillions of dollars a year are done by Fortune 500 companies, the Samsungs, the Philips that are at this show, that have to go and distribute funds to people in 180 countries by wire transfer, by the SWIFT system. I mean, if you say, how much would you save if you could do that instantly through a blockchain? And I think that is actually one of the biggest B2B opportunities of our lifetime.
Well, it's the death of paper. I mean, most of the systems that we use today, the financial system was designed prior to the internet. And those legacy systems are still how most of the financial system is still running on that old architecture. It's 1950s, 3-day settlement, T+3. Maybe you know this or don't know this, but NASDAQ, for example, is partnered with one of our portfolio companies, Chain, and they've just built NASDAQ's private market, meaning non-public stocks, but private stocks, pre-Facebook sort of going IPO. They've now just done the first trade where they're going to allow people to list their companies and issue their securities on the blockchain. So instead of a Bitcoin, you are issuing a stock that looks like a Bitcoin. It acts like a Bitcoin, but it happens to be a security for a private company. And it's my belief that once that's been taken to market at scale, the New York Stock Exchange is an investor in Coinbase. I believe that all of the world's securities are going to be settled using this type of technology. I believe all the world's currency trades, all the world's bonds, eventually all our identity is going to reside on this type of technology. I believe that elections in the future are going to run on this type of technology because you can't counterfeit a Bitcoin. You can have your Bitcoin stolen, but you can't counterfeit it. The technology is highly secure. It's been battle tested for 7 years, and it's never been vulnerable to any sort of failure. You can't cheat the system. When you read these headlines about $100 million being lost or X, Y, and Z, that's because of the company, in the case of Mt. Gox, having failed, and someone stole the money out of their wallet or stole their money out of that exchange. The underlying architecture, the technology itself for settling transactions securely is pretty well proven at this point. And I believe that all the world's assets are eventually going to be settled using
I like to give the example that when the Lehman Brothers went down, it didn't mean that the New York Stock Exchange was an unsustainable model.
Correct.
Yeah.
I was saying
and if you had instant settlement, it wouldn't have been a problem.
Right.
The beauty of Bitcoin, what Satoshi actually created, was that he solved the double spend problem, right? So previously, for a digital currency, if I give you a digital currency, I'll have a copy, right? It's digital, so you can just make copies. It's like MP3s, right? If I give you a song, I still have a copy. I can't possibly give you a song and someone somehow force me to not still have it, right? And what Bitcoin, the beauty of the mining, the distributed mining that Satoshi created, allowed that to happen. So previously, digital currency you had to have a central party that decides who owns how many coins. So if party A gave party B a coin, then party A no longer has it. Someone has to decide that. But with Bitcoin, no one does. And it's a decentralized currency where the system itself enforces that if I send you a Bitcoin, I no longer have it.
And about every 10 years, there's been a new paradigm that comes up and really changes the way business works. For example, when Mark Andreessen, who's a huge proponent investor, big investor in you from the early days, and just overall, he created, along with a team, the first web browser. And when he first started Netscape, I've seen interviews where he said, I thought, I was just going to convert everybody to the internet automatically. I went to Macy's and say, hey, you should sell stuff on the internet. And they laughed at him. They said, what, you think anybody would ever trust their money on the internet? You think anybody would ever give a credit card to the internet? And now obviously that's trillions of dollars of value. So similar things are going to happen in terms of the Bitcoin adoption. And Andreessen actually said that everything that someone says is a problem with Bitcoin, he sees as an opportunity to create $1 billion company to solve it. So I know we're running a little bit short on time. 5 minutes? Okay. Do you want to ask a question, or should we keep sort of going on our own?
No, I think there are people who do want to ask questions.
Okay, great.
Yeah. Sure. Hi, my name is Drew Clark. I wanted to ask this at the last panel, and I think it's just as appropriate this panel. Could you just be a little more specific about how the current banking infrastructure wants to use blockchain? I mean, wants to use Bitcoin, wants to use the blockchain. What exactly are they doing? What are they doing differently now than last year in terms of their reactions to this? And I loved your example of how some of the wire transfer companies could benefit from it, but just more of the traditional banking companies in the States.
Yeah, no, a number of call it the top 20 banks in the world had been in the closet and playing with the technology for, call it, the last 2 or 3 years. It wasn't until last year that pretty much every major bank has come out of the closet saying we've got teams that are working on this, either tens tens of people, or in some cases hundreds of people that are dedicated to this. And most of it is around the fact that there's been a lot of innovation on sort of the front end of the financial system in terms of mobile banking and algorithmic trading and high frequency, and you've seen a lot of innovation there, but the middle and back office has seen very little. And so mostly they're looking at using it as a way of just more efficiently managing the back office, primarily as a way of cutting cost, which is going to result in a lot of headcount probably going away, but major savings from a cost perspective, which will create better margins. Probably, again, very similar to that sort of twisted copper wire to voice over IP type of analogy. It's kind of back-end infrastructure. You're also seeing a lot of interest around sort of FX and currency, interbank sort of settlement, correspondent banking is kind of, so I think what most of the banks have said is, okay, let's take a look at our whole business. Which business units are going to be impacted by this positively, negatively? Some of them are going to go away. It's my opinion that correspondent banking, 10 years from now is probably gone. Instead of all the world's transactions funneling through, call it the top 10 banks, all the banks, in the same way I can do peer-to-peer transactions with Bitcoin, every bank can now connect to each other. So little banks will connect to other little banks without ever running through a major bank. So you see a lot of that. Ripple is probably one of the companies that's leading in that area right now to try and replace ACH and SWIFT.
And then the other developments in the last year are R3ECV, worst name ever. Is that like receive spell sideways or something? Is this consortium of banks that got together with a consulting group that has deep Wall Street and banking ties and said, let's all go.
Well, you have IBM and the Linux.
And IBM and Linux then, IBM and the Linux Foundation said, we're going to also be a kind of a cross standards group. And one of the things also that, as you moved from client server to cloud, cloud has the problem of being hacked. I mean, every week you hear about, X millions of numbers of hundreds of millions of credit cards being hacked. That just doesn't happen with the blockchain.
Valerian Bennett, theprotocol.tv. My biggest takeaway from the first half of the day, particularly with the traditional players in the game, has been they're really focused on minimizing friction. Like that's their whole focus is just how do we make this process easier and more convenient. Charlie, when you, as a member of Coinbase, which I think is the super simplest, best consumer-facing Bitcoin application out there, when I hear you say Bitcoin is still too hard to use, I'm wondering, how do you bridge that gap? How do you get to the point where they are in terms of convenience and simplicity?
So Coinbase's mission statement is to make Bitcoin easy to use, right? So we have like a wallet where people can store their Bitcoins. We secure the Bitcoins for them. Securing Bitcoins is quite tough. Your computer gets hacked into and all of a sudden you lose all your coins. So we do a very good job securing users' coins, so that makes it easy. We also let people easily buy and sell Bitcoins. So we try to do a lot of different things. Like one thing we launched last year is a Bitcoin debit card. I have one in my wallet. It's basically just a Visa debit card. You can use it anywhere Visa is accepted. And when you swipe the card, Bitcoin is deducted from your Coinbase account, sold for $1, and sent to the merchant. So in that sense, you're using Bitcoin without even knowing it. And you're paying merchants, and merchant doesn't even know that they're accepting Bitcoin. So stuff like that would make Bitcoin easy to use. And eventually, if merchants starts accepting Bitcoins themselves, then when you're swiping the card, you're paying the merchant Bitcoin, and they don't even have to touch $1. So that's like maybe like 5-10 years in the future, that could be a possibility. But then when that happens, customers will be using Bitcoin very easily. So these days, it's hard to use Bitcoin on a mobile wallet because when you compare that to swiping a credit card, why would you use a Bitcoin wallet where you have to like scan a QR code and then send a payment and check to make sure the merchant received it? So our goal is to try to make it as easy to use as like a credit card for payments, and you get all the benefits of Bitcoin.
Most of the friction, though, is going from fiat money or US dollars to Bitcoin. Once you're in Bitcoin, it's relatively easy to use.
I think maybe one more question.
I've been around for a long time, actually. At MIT, I did micromint and a lot of the early currency stuff in the 90s. And I've noticed over the last 20 years that despite Bitcoin's success, there's something missing. And so I'm going to solve that problem myself. Identity still has not been solved. And so I'm going to make a non-profit global scale identity repository which has reputation in Bitcoin wallets. And that's actually super hard to do if you think about it, because you can't be a company, so I'm going to be non-profit, right? And you can't be a government because they're not all trusted. So I'm neither of those two things. So I think if I succeed in doing that, if you tie identity then to all these services, you begin to solve a lot of these problems, maybe even some of the regulation problems. But it's very hard. So if anyone in this room cares about this issue, come and see me, because we all have to work together to make sure there's a good solution globally to identity that everyone buys into. And you can't have an agenda, you can't want to make a lot of money yourself on identity in order to solve the problem.
No, I think identity is obvious. Once identity's been solved, you know, there's going to be a number of interesting opportunities, and one I used as an example would be voting. You can't use this type of technology to manage an election until you're able to tie an identity to the blockchain. And I think that there's another 100 interesting sort of opportunities that emerge once someone has solved that. And I do believe that someone will solve it this year. I'll make that prediction. Identity will get cracked this year.
Yeah. Well, I think there'll probably be 5 or 6 competing standards this year, and one will probably get.
But I believe someone will solve it. Will have gotten scale?
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
But I believe someone will have solved it in a way where it's reliable enough that businesses and people will start to use it.